32 years, 318,000 flight hours, 43 different aircraft types, 0 accidents. Captain Richard Stone defined his career by these numbers. They were his armor, his crown, his certificate of invincibility. But do you know what the most dangerous thing is for a pilot who's lived through the brightest moments of his career? Arrogance. Uncontrollable, insidious arrogance that slowly seeps in. Seeing yourself above the rules. Thinking other people's time, rights, and dignity don't matter. This story is exactly about that. About how a man destroyed his 32-year career with 3 words. That's my seat. And about how the woman standing before him had been waiting 6 months for exactly this moment. Gate C-48 at Chicago O'Hare International Airport's Terminal 3 had its usual morning rush. Business travelers tapped frantically on laptops at charging stations. Families struggled with strollers and oversized carry-ons. The air smelled of overpriced coffee and that peculiar airport mixture of jet fuel, cleaning products, and stress. Flight 447 to Denver was scheduled to depart at 7:30 a.m. A routine 2-hour flight, nothing special. Just another Tuesday morning for Skybridge Airlines, a mid-sized carrier known for decent service and competitive prices. At 6:47 a.m., the gate agent, a young woman named Jennifer Martinez, made the pre-boarding announcement. Her voice was cheerful but practiced, the kind of artificial enthusiasm that comes from saying the same words 50 times a day. Good morning, passengers. We'll now begin boarding Flight 447 to Denver. We'd like to invite our first-class passengers, our Sky Elite members, and anyone needing extra time to board at this time. Among the first to stand was a woman who didn't fit the typical first-class passenger profile. She was in her early 40s, dressed in a simple charcoal gray pantsuit that was professional but unremarkable. No designer handbag, no expensive jewelry. Her only luggage was a slim black leather briefcase and a small carry-on bag. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical bun. She wore minimal makeup. Everything about her appearance said functional professional rather than executive. Her name was Margaret Chen, but the passengers around her didn't know that. They didn't know she held one of the most powerful positions in commercial aviation oversight. They didn't know she'd been flying incognito for the past 6 months, documenting patterns, building cases, waiting. Margaret handed her boarding pass to Jennifer at the gate. The agent scanned it and smiled. "Seat 4A, Miss Chen. Enjoy your flight." Margaret nodded politely and walked down the jet bridge. The morning sun was just beginning to paint the tarmac in shades of amber. Through the windows, she could see the ground crew moving around the Boeing 757, a workhorse of the skies that had been flying since the 1980s but remained reliable when properly maintained.
She stepped into the aircraft. The lead flight attendant, a man in his 50s named Robert, greeted her with a practiced smile. "Good morning. Welcome aboard." "Good morning," Margaret replied, her voice warm but not overly friendly. She'd learned over the years that being too memorable was counterproductive to her work. Blending in was the key. She walked down the narrow aisle toward first class. The cabin had that clean but slightly worn look of an aircraft that flew 8 legs a day, every day. The overhead bins were already starting to fill with bags. The seats in first class were wider than economy, covered in faux leather that was supposed to look luxurious but mostly just looked tired. Seat 4A, window seat, 4th row, left side. Margaret placed her briefcase in the overhead bin and sat down, tucking her small carry-on under the seat in front of her. She pulled out a technical aviation manual from her briefcase and began reading. To anyone watching, she looked like a mid-level manager catching up on work. Nothing special, nothing memorable. The boarding continued. Passengers filed in, struggling with bags, searching for their seats, settling into the familiar discomfort of air travel. Margaret observed them all with the trained eye of someone who had spent 2 decades in aviation safety. She noticed the mother traveling alone with 3 small children, already looking exhausted at 7 a.m. She noticed the elderly couple moving slowly, helping each other with their bags. She noticed the young businessman in an expensive suit who looked at everyone around him with barely concealed disdain. And then, at 7:02 a.m., she noticed him. Captain Richard Stone entered the aircraft from the forward galley. He wasn't scheduled to board yet. Pilots typically conducted their pre-flight checks and boarded through the jet bridge after most passengers were seated. But Stone had his own routines, his own rules. He was a tall man, just over 6 feet, with silver hair that he kept meticulously groomed. His uniform was perfectly pressed, the 4 gold stripes on his epaulets gleaming under the cabin lights. He carried himself with the bearing of someone who had commanded respect for so long that he no longer distinguished between respect and fear. Stone had started his career in the military, flying transport planes. He transitioned to commercial aviation in his early 30s and had been with Skybridge Airlines, or rather the 3 airlines that had merged and rebranded to become Skybridge, for his entire civilian career. He was, by every metric the airline measured, an excellent pilot. His technical skills were flawless. His record was spotless. His punctuality was legendary. But his personality was something else entirely. Robert, the lead flight attendant, saw Captain Stone enter and immediately tensed. He'd flown with Stone dozens of times. He knew the captain's moods, his preferences, his temper. And he knew that Stone was not someone you contradict, questioned, or inconvenienced. "Morning, Captain," Robert said, keeping his voice neutral. Stone barely acknowledged him with a nod. His eyes were scanning the first-class cabin, and they stopped on seat 4A, on Margaret Chen. Something shifted in his expression. It was subtle, a slight tightening around his eyes, a barely perceptible thinning of his lips. Margaret, still reading her manual, felt his gaze, but didn't look up. Not yet. She'd learned that timing was everything. Stone walked directly to row 4. He stopped in the aisle beside Margaret's seat and stood there, waiting. When she didn't immediately acknowledge him, he cleared his throat, loudly. Margaret looked up from her manual, her expression politely questioning. "Yes?" "You're in my seat," Stone said. His voice wasn't raised, but it carried absolute authority. The voice of a man who expected immediate compliance. Margaret glanced at her boarding pass, which she'd tucked into the seat pocket. "I believe my boarding pass indicates seat 4A. "I'm aware," Stone replied, his tone hardening. "But I'm the captain of this aircraft, and I prefer this seat for my pre-flight rest. You'll need to move." Around them, other passengers were starting to notice the interaction. The young businessman in 5C looked up from his phone with interest. The mother with 3 children in row 7 glanced over nervously, already worried about any delay. Robert, standing near the galley, closed his eyes briefly, as if bracing for impact. Margaret set her manual down carefully on her lap. She looked directly at Captain Stone, her expression calm but not yielding. "Captain, I understand your preference, but I purchased this seat specifically. I have back issues that require window seating, and first class was the only option with availability. I'm not able to accommodate your request." The temperature in the cabin seemed to drop several degrees. Stone's face flushed slightly. He wasn't accustomed to being told no, especially not by passengers, especially not on his aircraft. "Ma'am," he said, and the word came out like an insult. "I don't think you understand how this works. This is my aircraft. I am the captain. When I ask a passenger to move, they move. Now, I'll ask you one more time. Gather your belongings and move to another seat." Margaret didn't move. She didn't raise her voice. She simply held his gaze. "And I'll tell you one more time, Captain. I have a legitimate medical need for this specific seat, which I purchased in good faith." The standoff lasted perhaps 5 seconds, but it felt longer. The entire first-class cabin was watching now. Some passengers looked uncomfortable, others intrigued. One man in row 3 pulled out his phone, not quite pointing it at the scene, but ready to record if things escalated. Robert, standing near the galley, closed his eyes briefly, as if bracing for impact. Margaret set her manual down carefully on her lap. She looked directly at Captain Stone, her expression calm but not yielding. "Captain, I understand your preference, but I purchased this seat specifically. I have back issues that require window seating, and first class was the only option with availability. I'm not able to accommodate your request." The temperature in the cabin seemed to drop several degrees. Stone's face flushed slightly. He wasn't accustomed to being told no, especially not by passengers, especially not on his aircraft. "Ma'am," he said, and the word came out like an insult. "I don't think you understand how this works. This is my aircraft. I am the captain. When I ask a passenger to move, they move. Now, I'll ask you one more time. Gather your belongings and move to another seat." Margaret didn't move. She didn't raise her voice. She simply held his gaze. "And I'll tell you one more time, Captain. I have a legitimate medical need for this specific seat, which I purchased in good faith. I'm not moving." The standoff lasted perhaps 5 seconds, but it felt longer. The entire first-class cabin was watching now. Some passengers looked uncomfortable, others intrigued. One man in row 3 pulled out his phone, not quite pointing it at the scene, but ready to record if things escalated. Robert stepped forward, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "Stay out of this, Robert," Stone snapped, not taking his eyes off Margaret. Then, to her, "Fine. You want to be difficult? Let me explain something to you. I've been flying for over 3 decades. I have more flight hours than you have weeks of life. I know more about aviation safety, passenger management, and cockpit command than you could learn in 10 lifetimes. When I determine that I need a specific seat for operational reasons, and yes, crew rest is an operational reason, then that supersedes any passenger preference. This is not a democracy. This is not a negotiation. This is a direct instruction from the pilot in command." He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice, but making sure it was still audible to those nearby. "Now, you can either move to another seat voluntarily, or I can have you removed from this aircraft for interfering with crew operations. Your choice. But this flight doesn't leave the gate until you're out of my seat." Margaret remained perfectly still. Her face showed no anger, no fear, no intimidation. Instead, there was something else in her eyes, something that Stone, in his arrogance, didn't recognize. It was the look of someone who had finally gotten exactly what they'd been waiting for. "I see," Margaret said quietly. "So you're refusing to operate this flight unless I give up my purchased seat for your personal comfort." "I'm ensuring operational safety," Stone corrected sharply. "By threatening to delay or cancel a flight full of passengers because you want a window seat? By exercising my authority as captain to make decisions about crew readiness and safety." Margaret nodded slowly, as if considering this. Then she reached down to her carry-on bag under the seat. Stone watched with satisfaction, assuming she was gathering her belongings to move. Some passengers shifted in their seats, the drama apparently over. But Margaret didn't pull out a bag. She pulled out a slim black leather wallet. And when she opened it, the gold badge inside caught the morning light streaming through the windows. She held it up so Stone could see it clearly. "Captain Stone," she said, her voice still calm, but now carrying a weight of authority that seemed to press down on the entire cabin. "My name is Margaret Chen. I'm the Director of Airline Compliance and Oversight for the Federal Aviation Administration, Central Region. This is my 6th flight observing Skybridge Airlines operations. I've been documenting a pattern of protocol violations, crew intimidation, and passenger mistreatment, and you just provided me with the clearest example yet." The color drained from Richard Stone's face. The cabin went absolutely silent. Even the mother's young children seemed to sense something important was happening and stopped fidgeting. The businessman in 5C actually gasped. Robert's eyes went wide with a mixture of shock and something that looked almost like relief. Margaret continued, her voice steady. You threatened to delay or cancel a commercial flight affecting over 200 passengers, not for any legitimate safety concern, but because you wanted personal comfort? I'm ensuring operational safety, Stone corrected sharply. By threatening to delay or cancel a flight full of passengers because you want a window seat? By exercising my authority as captain to make decisions about crew readiness and safety. Margaret nodded slowly, as if considering this. Then she reached down to her carry-on bag under the seat. Stone watched with satisfaction, assuming she was gathering her belongings to move. Some passengers shifted in their seats, the drama apparently over. But Margaret didn't pull out a bag. She pulled out a slim black leather wallet. And when she opened it, the gold badge inside caught the morning light streaming through the windows. She held it up so Stone could see it clearly. Captain Stone, she said, her voice still calm, but now carrying a weight of authority that seemed to press down on the entire cabin. My name is Margaret Chen. I'm the Director of Airline Compliance and Oversight for the Federal Aviation Administration, Central Region. This is my 6th flight observing Skybridge Airlines operations. I've been documenting a pattern of protocol violations, crew intimidation, and passenger mistreatment. And you just provided me with the clearest example yet. The color drained from Richard Stone's face. The cabin went absolutely silent. Even the mother's young children seemed to sense something important was happening and stopped fidgeting. The businessman in 5C actually gasped. Robert's eyes went wide with a mixture of shock and something that looked almost like relief. Margaret continued, her voice steady. You threatened to delay or cancel a commercial flight affecting over 200 passengers, not for any legitimate safety concern, but because you wanted personal comfort? You attempted to coerce a passenger out of her legally purchased seat using your position of authority. You dismissed a medical accommodation request without verification. And you did all of this in front of witnesses, including your own crew. The color drained from Richard Stone's face. The cabin went absolutely silent. Even the mother's young children seemed to sense something important was happening and stopped fidgeting. The businessman in 5C actually gasped. Robert's eyes went wide with a mixture of shock and something that looked almost like relief. Margaret continued, her voice steady. You threatened to delay or cancel a commercial flight affecting over 200 passengers, not for any legitimate safety concern, but because you wanted personal comfort? You attempted to coerce a passenger out of her legally purchased seat using your position of authority. You dismissed a medical accommodation request without verification. And you did all of this in front of witnesses, including your own crew. She closed the wallet and set it on her lap, then picked up her aviation manual again. I will remain in seat 4A, which I purchased and am entitled to occupy. You will proceed with your pre-flight duties. And when we land in Denver, you and I will have a very detailed conversation in the company of your airline's senior management and FAA investigators. Do you understand, Captain? Stone opened his mouth, but no words came out. His face had gone from pale to red to pale again. His carefully constructed authority, his 3 decades of command, his unquestioned power, all of it crumbled in an instant. He stammered, then seemed to realize that anything he said would only make things worse. He straightened up, trying to regain some dignity, but his hands were trembling slightly. I'll proceed to the cockpit. Yes, Margaret said simply, you do that. Stone turned and walked stiffly toward the cockpit, his earlier swagger completely gone. He looked like a man walking to his own execution, which, in a professional sense, he was. As the cockpit door closed behind him, the cabin erupted in whispered conversations. Robert approached Margaret, his expression apologetic and awed. "Ma'am, Director Chen, I had no idea. If I'd known." Margaret held up a hand gently. "Robert, you handled that professionally. You attempted to de-escalate. That will all be in my report." She glanced at his name tag. "Robert Michaels, correct?" "Yes, ma'am." "You've been with Skybridge for how long?" 14 years. "Have you witnessed similar behavior from Captain Stone before?" Robert hesitated. This was the moment of truth for him, too. He could protect his captain, maintain the code of silence that often existed among crew members, or he could tell the truth. He chose the truth. "Yes, ma'am, multiple times. He has a reputation. We call him stone cold behind his back, not because he's calm, but because he's harsh. He's been written up internally before, but nothing ever seems to come of it. Senior captains have a lot of protection, and passengers who complain usually just get vouchers and apologies, and nothing changes." Margaret nodded, making a mental note. This was exactly the kind of systemic issue she'd been investigating. "Thank you for your honesty, Robert. I'll need a formal statement from you, but it can wait until we land. For now, let's proceed with the flight as normally as possible." "Yes, ma'am. And thank you. A lot of us have wanted someone to finally see what really happens on these flights." As Robert moved away to continue his boarding duties, Margaret settled back into her seat. She wasn't angry. She wasn't triumphant. She was simply satisfied. This was what she'd trained for, what she'd worked toward for 20 years. Moments like this, when arrogance met accountability and lost. In the cockpit, Captain Richard Stone sat in the left-hand seat, staring at the instrument panel without really seeing it. His first officer, a younger pilot named David Park, had been running through pre-flight checks and had witnessed the tail end of the confrontation through the open cockpit door before he had entered. "Captain," David ventured carefully, "is everything all right?" "Just run the damn checklist," Stone snapped. But both of them knew that nothing was all right. Nothing would ever be all right again for Captain Richard Stone.
The boarding completed in near silence. The passengers who had witnessed the confrontation couldn't stop whispering about it. The story spread through the cabin like wildfire. By the time the last passenger boarded, everyone on the aircraft seemed to know that the woman in 4A was an FAA director and that the captain had just made a catastrophic mistake. At 7:28 a.m., 2 minutes before scheduled departure, Robert made the standard announcements. His voice was steady, professional, giving no hint of the drama that had just unfolded. The cabin doors were closed. The ground crew disconnected the jet bridge. In the cockpit, Stone and David worked through their checklists in tense silence. David wanted to ask questions, wanted to understand what had happened, what it meant. But the rigid set of Stone's jaw made it clear that any conversation would be unwelcome. "Chicago ground, Skybridge 447 requesting pushback from gate C48, David radioed. "Skybridge 447, Chicago ground, pushback approved. Contact ground point 9 on release." The familiar mechanical shudder ran through the aircraft as the tug began pushing them back from the gate. Through the cockpit windows, the vast expanse of O'Hare stretched out before them. Dozens of aircraft taxiing, taking off, landing in the carefully choreographed ballet of modern aviation. Any other day, this would have been routine for Stone. Another flight, another command, another 2 hours of the work he'd done thousands of times before. But today, every movement felt wrong. His hands felt clumsy on the controls. His mind kept replaying the moment that woman, that FAA director, had shown her badge. The look in her eyes, the calm, absolute authority in her voice. He'd been so certain, so absolutely certain that he was in the right, that his rank, his experience, his position gave him the authority to make such demands. It was what he'd always done, what he'd gotten away with for years. And now it was all falling apart. The pushback completed, and the tug disconnected from the nose gear. Stone heard the confirmation from the ground crew through his headset, a routine call he'd heard 10,000 times before. But today, nothing felt routine.
Skybridge 447 taxi to runway 27 left via taxiway Alpha, Bravo, and Charlie. The ground controller's voice crackled through the radio. Taxi to 27 left via Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, Skybridge 447, David responded, his voice steady and professional. The Boeing 757 began its slow taxi toward the departure runway, joining the queue of aircraft making their way through O'Hare's complex network of taxiways. Outside the cockpit windows, the morning sun had fully risen now, casting long shadows across the concrete. Other aircraft passed them going the opposite direction, returning from their flights. The whole airport was a living machine, constantly moving, constantly working. Stone's hands moved through the taxi checklist automatically, muscle memory guiding him through procedures he could do in his sleep. But his mind was elsewhere, replaying the confrontation over and over. The woman's face when she'd shown that badge, the way the cabin had gone silent. The look on Robert's face. Was that satisfaction he'd seen there? Had his own crew been hoping for this? They reached the runway hold short line. David contacted the tower. Tower, Skybridge 447, holding short 27 left, ready for departure. Skybridge 447, runway 27 left, cleared for takeoff. Wind 260 at 8 knots. Cleared for takeoff, 27 left, Skybridge 447. David looked at Stone, waiting for the captain to advance the throttles. It was the captain's prerogative on takeoff. But Stone seemed frozen, staring straight ahead. "Captain," David said quietly, "we're cleared." Stone snapped back to the present. "I've got it," he muttered, his hands moving to the throttle levers. He pushed them forward, and the twin engines spooled up with their familiar roar. The aircraft began accelerating down the runway, faster and faster, the painted centerline rushing beneath them. 80 knots, David called out. "Check," Stone responded automatically. V1, the point of no return, the speed beyond which they were committed to take off. Rotate, the speed at which the nose should lift off the ground. Stone pulled back on the yoke, and the Boeing 757 lifted gracefully into the morning sky. The landing gear thumped as it retracted into the belly of the aircraft. The flaps came up in stages as they climbed. Chicago fell away beneath them, the city spreading out in its familiar grid pattern. "Positive rate, gear up," David confirmed. "Gear up," Stone acknowledged. They climbed through the scattered clouds, leveling off at their assigned cruising altitude of 37,000 feet. The autopilot engaged with a soft click. The flight would take approximately 2 hours. 2 hours during which Stone would have to sit in this cockpit, knowing that his career was effectively over. In the cabin, the flight attendants had begun their service. Robert moved through first class with practiced efficiency, offering drinks and snacks. When he reached Margaret in 4A, she looked up from her laptop. "Can I get you anything, Director Chen?" he asked quietly. "Just water, please. Thank you, Robert." As he poured her water, Robert leaned in slightly and spoke in a low voice that wouldn't carry. "Ma'am, if I may ask, how long have you been observing our flights?" 6 months, Margaret replied softly. 12 flights total with Skybridge. This is my last observation flight. I was preparing to file my report next week." And Captain Stone. "This was his 4th flight that I've observed. The previous 3 flights, I was seated in economy or different sections of first class. His behavior has been consistently problematic, but always just subtle enough, just careful enough that it could be dismissed as personality or command style. What happened today was different. He crossed a clear line, and he did it in front of multiple witnesses, including his own crew. This isn't something the airline can sweep under the rug with a written warning." Robert nodded slowly, processing this. "There are a lot of good people at Skybridge. Good pilots, good crew. But we have a culture problem. The senior captains, especially ones like Stone who've been here since the merger days, they think they're untouchable. And for a long time, they have been." "That's about to change," Margaret said simply. The flight continued smoothly. The Boeing 757 crossed from Illinois into Iowa, the patchwork of farmland spreading out below. In the cockpit, Stone and David flew in near silence. speaking only when necessary for their duties. David had tried once or twice to make conversation, to understand what was happening, but Stone's one-word responses had shut down any attempt at communication. Stone's mind was a whirlwind. He kept trying to find a way out, some angle that would let him salvage this situation. Maybe he could say it was a misunderstanding, that he'd been concerned about a legitimate safety issue. Maybe he could argue that he'd been within his rights as captain to manage seating assignments. Maybe he could claim that the FAA director had been combative and that he'd only responded to her attitude. But even as these thoughts formed, he knew they were desperate fantasies. There had been dozens of witnesses. The confrontation had probably been recorded on multiple phones. And Margaret Chen hadn't been combative. She'd been calm, professional, and absolutely within her rights. He'd been the aggressor, the bully, the one who'd overstepped. And the worst part, the part that gnawed at him most, was that this wasn't really about one incident. She'd said this was her 6th flight observing Skybridge. She'd been watching, documenting, building a case. This morning's confrontation was just the final piece of evidence in a much larger pattern. How many other times had he treated passengers poorly? How many times had he used his authority to get what he wanted? Consequences be damned. How many crew members had he intimidated into silence? He'd never thought of it as misconduct. He thought of it as leadership, as command presence, as maintaining standards. But now, seeing it through the lens of federal investigation, he realized what it really was: abuse of power. The 2 hours passed slowly. The in-flight service completed. Passengers read, worked, slept, or watched movies on their personal devices. In 4A, Margaret worked steadily on her laptop, typing notes, cross-referencing regulations, preparing the foundation of her report. She'd done this kind of work many times before, but it never got old. Every investigation, every case was another step toward making commercial aviation safer, more accountable, more just. As they began their descent into Denver, David handled most of the radio communications. Stone seemed to be retreating further into himself, his responses becoming more mechanical, more distant. The Colorado Rockies rose up in the distance, their snow-capped peaks magnificent against the clear blue sky. Denver approach, Skybridge 447, descending to 10,000, Denver radioed. Skybridge 447, Denver approach, descend and maintain 7,000. Expect runway 25 right. The landing gear extended with a solid thunk. The flaps came down in stages, changing the aerodynamics of the aircraft, slowing it for landing. Denver International Airport came into view, its distinctive white peaked roof designed to evoke the Rocky Mountains. Skybridge 447 cleared to land runway 25 right, the tower controller said. Clear to land 25 right, Skybridge 447, David confirmed. Stone took manual control for the landing, his hands moving with the precision of 32 years of experience. Whatever else might be true about him, whatever flaws his character might have, his technical skills were undeniable. The 757 touched down smoothly, the main gear kissing the runway with barely a bump. The thrust reversers deployed with their characteristic roar, slowing the aircraft. "Nice landing, Captain," David said, a reflexive comment born of years of cockpit culture. Stone didn't respond. They taxied to gate B-17, following the ground crew's marshalling signals. The engine spooled down. The seatbelt sign chimed off. Around them, passengers began gathering their belongings, standing up, opening overhead bins. But Stone made no move to leave his seat. He sat there, staring at the instrument panel, his hands resting on his lap. "Captain," David said, "we're parked." "I know," Stone said quietly. "Are you? Is there anything I should know? Anything I need to do?" Stone finally turned to look at his first officer. David was in his early 30s, enthusiastic, still in love with flying. He reminded Stone of himself 3 decades ago, back when this job had felt like a calling rather than an entitlement. "Watch yourself, David," Stone said, and his voice was hollow. "Don't ever let yourself think you're above the rules. Don't ever let yourself think your rank gives you the right to treat people however you want, because eventually someone will be watching, and when they are, everything you've built can disappear in an instant. David didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. In the cabin, Margaret gathered her belongings. She'd been in contact via encrypted message with the FAA's Denver field office during the flight. They were already coordinating with Skybridge's corporate headquarters. By the time this aircraft emptied, there would be a team waiting. The passengers began deplaning, filing out through the jet bridge into the terminal. Some of them glanced back at Margaret as they passed, recognizing her from the earlier confrontation. A few nodded respectfully. One elderly man stopped and said, "Thank you for what you do, ma'am." Margaret smiled and nodded in acknowledgement. Robert approached her as the last passengers exited. "Director Chen, there are some people waiting at the gate for you, from the airline's management." "I expected that. Thank you, Robert. You'll be asked to give a statement. Just tell the truth, exactly as you saw it." "I will, ma'am." Margaret stepped off the aircraft into the jet bridge. Waiting at the gate were 5 people. She recognized 2 of them immediately: James Walsh, Skybridge's Regional Vice President of Operations, and Sandra Kim, the airline's Chief Legal Counsel. The other 3 were FAA personnel from the Denver field office. Walsh stepped forward, his face a mixture of professional concern and barely suppressed panic. "Director Chen, I'm Jim Walsh. We spoke on the phone 6 months ago when you informed us of your investigation. I want to assure you that Skybridge takes this matter extremely seriously." "I'm sure you do, Mr. Walsh, now that it's become public and undeniable. Where were you taking it seriously when I submitted 3 confidential reports about Captain Stone's behavior over the past 4 months? Walsh's face reddened. We conducted internal reviews. Captain Stone was counseled. He was given written warnings that went into a file that nobody ever looked at." Margaret cut him off, her voice still calm but with an edge now. "He was counseled in meetings where he was told to be more careful, not to actually change his behavior. He was protected because he's a senior captain with excellent technical skills and an on-time record. And that protection ends today." Sandra Kim, the lawyer, stepped in smoothly. "Director Chen, we're fully prepared to cooperate with your investigation. We've already grounded Captain Stone pending a full internal review. We're prepared to implement whatever corrective measures the FAA requires." "Good, because here's what's going to happen. Captain Stone's license will be suspended immediately pending an FAA hearing. Your airline will be subject to a comprehensive culture and compliance audit. Every captain with more than 20 years tenure will undergo mandatory retraining on passenger rights, crew relations, and appropriate use of command authority. Your complaint and reporting systems will be completely overhauled. And Mr. Walsh, you and I are going to have a very long conversation about why 3 confidential reports from a federal investigator didn't result in meaningful action." She turned to the FAA personnel. "I need a secure room to debrief my observations and begin the formal report. I also need statements taken from the lead flight attendant, Robert Michaels, and First Officer David Park. They're both still on the aircraft." One of the FAA investigators nodded. "We have a conference room reserved in the airport's administrative section. We can begin immediately." Margaret looked back at the jet bridge, where through the windows she could see the Boeing 757 still parked at the gate. Inside that aircraft, in the cockpit, Captain Richard Stone was sitting alone, his 32-year career in ruins. She felt no satisfaction in that, no sense of victory or vindication. She'd done this job long enough to know that moments like this were necessary but not pleasant. A man's livelihood was about to be destroyed. His identity, everything he'd built his life around, was finished. And while his behavior had made it necessary, while he'd brought this on himself through years of arrogance and abuse of power, it was still a human tragedy. But the 200 passengers on that flight, and the thousands more who would fly on future flights, deserved better. They deserved captains who understood that authority came with responsibility. They deserved an airline culture that valued safety and respect over protecting senior personnel. And if one man's career had to end to make that happen, then so be it. "Let's get started," Margaret said, and walked toward the administrative offices, her briefcase in hand. Behind her, at gate B-17, Robert Michaels stood in the aircraft doorway, watching her go. Then he turned and walked back into the cabin, back toward the cockpit. He knocked on the door.
"Captain, they need you at the gate." There was a long silence. Then Stone's voice, quiet and defeated. "I know." The cockpit door opened. Captain Richard Stone emerged, still in his uniform, still wearing his 4 gold stripes. But everything else about him had changed. His shoulders were slumped. His face was ashing. His eyes, which had been so hard and certain that morning, now looked lost. He walked past Robert without a word, down the aisle through the empty cabin, past the seat, 4A, where this morning his world had ended. He stepped into the jet bridge and saw the small crowd waiting at the gate, the airline executives, the FAA personnel, and standing slightly apart from them, watching him with an expression that was neither cruel nor kind, but simply professional, was Margaret Chen. Their eyes met for just a moment. Stone wanted to say something, an apology, an explanation, a plea. But what could he say? What words could possibly matter now? He walked toward them, toward whatever came next. A captain without a command, a pilot without a license, a man who had finally, belatedly, learned that arrogance always has a price. And in this case, the bill had come due in full. The conference room in Denver International Airport's administrative section was sparse and functional. Gray walls, a long table with uncomfortable chairs, fluorescent lighting that hummed faintly. This was where airport security conducted interviews, where airline management held emergency meetings, where the unsexy, bureaucratic work of aviation happened away from the glamorous terminals. Margaret sat at the head of the table, her laptop open, a digital recorder placed prominently in the center. To her left sat Thomas Rivera and Ellen Foster, 2 senior investigators from the FAA's Denver field office. To her right sat James Walsh and Sandra Kim from Skybridge Airlines. At the far end of the table, looking small and diminished despite his 6-foot frame, sat Captain Richard Stone. His attorney, a sharp-eyed man named Jeffrey Barnes, who specialized in aviation employment law, sat beside him. Barnes had arrived within 40 minutes of being called, which suggested he was used to emergency situations like this. He was whispering to Stone, undoubtedly telling him to say as little as possible, to let the lawyer do the talking. But Margaret didn't need Stone to talk much. She had what she needed, the incident itself, witnessed by dozens of passengers and crew. The pattern of behavior documented over 6 months and 12 flights. The internal reports that Skybridge had received but failed to act upon. This wasn't a case that would hinge on he said, she said testimony. This was open and shut. Margaret pressed record on the digital device. "This is Director Margaret Chen, FAA Central Region Compliance and Oversight, beginning formal interview regarding incident SB 447-15. Present are FAA investigators Thomas Rivera and Ellen Foster, Skybridge Airlines representatives James Walsh and Sandra Kim, Captain Richard Stone, and attorney Jeffrey Barnes. Captain Stone, you've been advised of your rights and the nature of this investigation." Barnes answered before Stone could. "My client acknowledges he's been advised, Director Chen. Before we begin, I want to state for the record that Captain Stone is here voluntarily and is prepared to cooperate fully with this investigation." "Noted," Margaret said. She turned her attention to Stone directly. "Captain Stone, how long have you been employed by Skybridge Airlines and its predecessor carriers?" Stone cleared his throat. His voice, which had been so commanding that morning, now sounded thin and uncertain. 32 years. Started with Continental West in 1991, transitioned through the merger to Skybridge in 2015. "And during those 32 years, have you ever received any formal complaints or disciplinary actions regarding your conduct toward passengers or crew?" Barnes interjected again. "Director Chen, I'd like to note that my client's employment record should speak for itself. Captain Stone has an exemplary technical record. I'm asking about conduct, not technical performance, Mr. Barnes." "Captain Stone?" Stone glanced at his lawyer, who gave him a small nod. I've had a few complaints over the years, nothing major. Passengers sometimes don't understand the realities of flight operations. They think they can question every decision. Part of being a captain is maintaining authority." "How many complaints?" "I don't know exactly. Maybe a dozen. Over 32 years, that's nothing." Margaret pulled up a document on her laptop and turned it so everyone could see. According to Skybridge's own records, you've had 27 formal passenger complaints filed against you in the past decade alone. That doesn't include informal complaints or issues that crew members reported internally but never escalated. The color drained from Stone's face. I wasn't aware the number was that high. Were you aware that you've been the subject of 3 separate FAA confidential reports in the past 4 months, each detailing incidents of inappropriate use of command authority? James Walsh shifted uncomfortably in his seat. This was clearly news to him as well, which meant someone in Skybridge's management had been burying these reports. Margaret made a mental note to dig into that later. I was not, Stone said quietly. Were you aware that your nickname among flight attendants is Stone Cold, and that junior crew members specifically request not to be assigned to your flights? Stone's jaw tightened. I run a tight ship. Not everyone appreciates discipline. Is that what you call what happened this morning? Discipline? Barnes put a hand on Stone's arm, a warning not to answer. But Stone pulled away from his lawyer's touch. Something in him seemed to break. The defensive posture crumbled. No, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. No, that's not what I'd call it. Then what would you call it, Captain? Stone was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his words came slowly, as if each one cost him something. I was used to getting my way. For 32 years, when I wanted something on my aircraft, I got it. When I told someone to do something, they did it. And somewhere along the way, I stopped seeing passengers as people I was serving and started seeing them as obstacles, as inconveniences. And this morning, when that woman, when you said no to me, I couldn't handle it. I had to win. I had to exert my authority. And I threatened to delay or cancel an entire flight, affecting hundreds of people, because I wanted a window seat. The room was absolutely silent. Even Barnes looked surprised that his client had offered such a complete confession. Why did you want that particular seat? Margaret asked, her voice gentler now. Because it's the most comfortable. Because I like to rest during that phase of the flight, and the window seat in row 4 has the best recline. Because, he laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. Because I'm the captain, and I thought that meant I could have whatever I wanted. Margaret nodded slowly. Captain Stone, I appreciate your honesty, but I need to be clear with you about what happens next. Based on the incident this morning, and based on the pattern of behavior documented over the past 6 months, I am immediately suspending your airline transport pilot license pending a formal FAA hearing. That suspension is effective as of this moment. You will not operate any commercial aircraft until and unless that hearing results in reinstatement, which I consider highly unlikely. Stone nodded, his eyes fixed on the table. He'd known this was coming, but hearing it said out loud made it real. Additionally, Margaret continued, Skybridge Airlines will be subject to a comprehensive audit of its safety culture, complaint handling procedures, and crew management practices. Mr. Walsh, I expect full cooperation from your airline. This audit will take approximately 3 months, and during that time, Skybridge will implement immediate interim measures including mandatory training for all senior captains. Walsh nodded quickly. Absolutely, Director Chen. We'll do whatever's necessary. I'll hold you to that. I turned to her fellow FAA investigators. Tom, Ellen, I need you to conduct immediate interviews with First Officer David Park and Lead Flight Attendant Robert Michaels. I want their statements on record today. Then I want a review of Captain Stone's complete flight history for the past 2 years. Cockpit voice recordings were available, crew reports, passenger complaints, everything. Understood, Rivera said, making notes. Margaret looked back at Stone one more time. Captain, do you have anything else you'd like to say for the record? Stone was quiet for a long moment. Then he looked up, meeting Margaret's eyes directly for the first time since they'd sat down. I'm sorry, he said. Not because I got caught, not because I'm losing my license, but because it took losing everything for me to finally understand what I'd become. I thought being a good pilot was about technical skill and command presence. I thought respect was the same as fear. I was wrong. And I'm sorry it took me 32 years and destroying my career to figure that out.
Margaret nodded. She'd heard apologies before, some sincere, some calculated. This one felt genuine, but it was also far too late. "Thank you, Captain Stone. That's all for now." Stone stood up, Barnes rising with him. The lawyer put a hand on his client's shoulder, a gesture that was surprisingly human. They walked to the door together, Stone's uniform still crisp and perfect, his gold stripes still gleaming, but all of it now just costume. He was no longer a captain. He was just a man who'd learned a terrible lesson at the worst possible price. As the door closed behind them, James Walsh leaned forward across the table. "Director Chen, I want you to know that Skybridge takes full responsibility for this situation. We clearly failed in our oversight. We allowed a problematic pattern of behavior to continue unchecked. We're prepared to make whatever changes necessary to ensure this never happens again." Margaret fixed him with a level stare. Mr.
Walsh's face flushed. "That's not fair. We run a safe airline. Our safety record is excellent." "Your safety record is excellent because of the hundreds of pilots and crew members who do their jobs professionally despite a toxic culture, not because of it. You've been lucky. Today, that luck ran out." She closed her laptop with a decisive click. "Here's what's going to happen. I'm grounding your entire fleet pending compliance review. Every aircraft stays on the ground until my team has verified that your safety management systems are actually functioning." "You can't do that." Walsh half stood from his chair. "We have thousands of passengers booked on flights. The financial impact would be catastrophic. Yes, probably, but not as catastrophic as an accident caused by a captain who thinks rules don't apply to him. Not as catastrophic as the erosion of safety culture that happens when crew members learn that speaking up gets them nowhere." Margaret's voice was ice. "You want to keep flying? Then prove to me that you deserve to. Prove that passenger safety is actually your top priority, not just words in a press release." Sandra Kim, seeing that Walsh was about to make things worse, put a hand on his arm. "Director Chen, we understand the severity of the situation. Give us 72 hours to present a comprehensive action plan. We'll include immediate policy changes, management accountability measures, and a timeline for culture reform. If you find it acceptable, can we discuss a modified grounding that allows us to maintain essential operations?" Margaret considered this. Grounding an entire airline was a nuclear option, one that she had the authority to execute, but that would have massive ripple effects through the aviation industry. If Skybridge was genuinely willing to make immediate, meaningful changes, a more targeted approach might be more effective. 48 hours, she said. Present me with a plan that includes immediate suspension of all captains with pending complaints, mandatory stand-down training for your entire pilot corps, implementation of an independent complaint review board, and personal accountability for management failures. If I'm satisfied with the plan, we'll limit the grounding to a temporary operational pause rather than a full shutdown. If I'm not satisfied, or if you try to give me a public relations document instead of real reform, the entire fleet stays on the ground until I see actual change." Walsh nodded, chastened. 48 hours, you'll have it. Then we're done here. For now. As Walsh and Kim left the room, Margaret sat back in her chair and closed her eyes for a moment. Thomas Rivera and Ellen Foster exchanged glances, both looking somewhat awed by what they just witnessed. "That was intense," Foster said quietly. Margaret opened her eyes. It needed to be. They were going to try to make this about one bad apple, one problematic captain who slipped through the cracks. But that's not what this is. This is systemic failure. And if we let them treat it as anything less, nothing will actually change. "Do you think they'll deliver?" Rivera asked. "A real plan, I mean, not just corporate speak."
"They will if they want to stay in business. I wasn't bluffing about grounding the fleet, and they know it." Margaret pulled out her phone and began typing. "I need to brief the regional director and start putting together the audit team. This is going to be a 3-month intensive investigation." "What about Captain Stone?" Foster asked. "Do you think his license will be permanently revoked?" "That's up to the hearing board, but yes, almost certainly. He's finished. And honestly, that's probably for the best. He's a skilled pilot technically, but he has no business being in command of an aircraft full of people. Command requires judgment, empathy, leadership, all the things he demonstrated this morning that he lacks. Margaret thought about Stone's confession, his admission that it had taken losing everything to understand what he'd become. There was tragedy in that. A man who'd spent 3 decades mastering a craft only to destroy his career because he couldn't master himself. But her sympathy had limits. Stone had made choices, day after day, year after year. He'd chosen arrogance over humility, power over service, ego over responsibility. And those choices had consequences, not just for him, but for every passenger who'd felt diminished by his behavior, every crew member who'd been afraid to speak up, every junior pilot who'd learned from his example that treating people poorly was acceptable if you had enough seniority. No, she didn't take pleasure in ending his career, but she didn't regret it either. Some lessons could only be learned the hard way, and sometimes the price of that education was everything you'd spent a lifetime building. Her phone buzzed with an incoming call from the FAA regional director. Margaret took a breath, composed herself, and answered. "Director Chen," she said, her voice once again crisp and professional. "Yes, sir, I'm prepared to brief you on the situation. It's significant. We're going to need to mobilize a full audit team." 6 weeks later, Richard Stone sat in a vinyl chair in the waiting area of the FAA's regional headquarters in Kansas City. The building was brutally bureaucratic. Beige walls, commercial carpeting, motivational posters about safety that nobody really looked at. He'd been here twice before in his career, both times for routine license renewals. Those visits had been formalities, rubber stamps on a career that seemed destined to continue until he chose to retire. This visit was different. Today was his formal hearing before the FAA Certificate Action Review Board. The hearing that would determine whether his airline transport pilot license would be permanently revoked or if there was any path to redemption. His attorney, Jeffrey Barnes, sat beside him reviewing notes on a tablet. Barnes had been cautiously optimistic in their preparation meetings, talking about character witnesses and rehabilitation plans. But Stone knew the truth. This hearing was a formality. The outcome had been decided the moment Margaret Chen had shown her badge. The door to the hearing room opened, and a woman in FAA uniform stepped out. "Captain Stone, the board is ready for you." Stone stood, his legs feeling unsteady. He'd lost 15 pounds in the past 6 weeks. Sleep came fitfully, when it came at all. His wife, Patricia, had barely spoken to him since the incident became public. His 2 adult children had sent perfunctory text messages of support, but he could feel their disappointment through the carefully neutral words. His friends from the airline, the ones he thought were friends, had stopped returning his calls. He walked into the hearing room. It was set up like a small courtroom, with a raised panel desk at the front where 3 board members sat. In the center was Frank Morrison, a retired airline captain who now served as the board's chair. To his left was Dr. Sarah Chen, an aviation psychologist who specialized in crew resource management. To his right was Daniel Wu, a senior FAA regulatory attorney. Margaret Chen was also present, sitting to the side at a separate table with a stack of documents in front of her. When Stone entered, she looked up briefly, her expression neutral. She wasn't here to gloat or punish. She was here to present facts. Somehow, that made it worse. "Captain Stone, please be seated," Morrison said, his voice carrying the formal weight of procedure. "This is a hearing to determine the status of your airline transport pilot license following the incident of October 15th aboard Skybridge Airlines Flight 447. You have the right to be represented by counsel, to present evidence on your behalf, and to question any witnesses. Do you understand these rights?" "Yes, sir," Stone replied, his voice hoarse. "Very well. Director Chen, please present the findings of your investigation." Margaret stood and approached a small podium. She didn't need her notes. She'd lived with this case for 6 months. On October 15th, Captain Stone engaged in conduct that constituted gross abuse of command authority, attempted coercion of a passenger, and threatened disruption of scheduled commercial service for personal convenience rather than any legitimate safety concern. This incident was witnessed by multiple passengers and crew members, and Captain Stone has acknowledged the basic facts of what occurred. She pulled up a presentation on a screen behind the board. However, this incident was not an isolated event, but rather the culmination of a pattern of behavior documented over a 6-month period. During that time, I personally observed Captain Stone on 4 separate flights. I documented instances of unnecessary crew intimidation, dismissal of legitimate passenger concerns, and consistent elevation of personal preference over company policy and passenger rights. Dr. Chen, the psychologist on the panel, leaned forward. Director Chen, in your professional opinion, does Captain Stone's behavior pattern suggest a temperament unsuitable for command responsibilities? Margaret chose her words carefully. In my professional opinion, Captain Stone demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of what command authority means in a commercial aviation context. He treated authority as a tool for personal benefit rather than as a responsibility for the safety and well-being of passengers and crew. Whether that temperament can be modified through intervention is not for me to determine. That's the purpose of this hearing. Morrison looked at Stone. Captain Stone, you'll have the opportunity to respond to these findings, but first I want to hear from some of the witnesses. We'll begin with First Officer David Park.
David Park entered the room looking uncomfortable in his suit. He'd been Stone's first officer on that fateful flight to Denver, and he'd been subpoenaed to testify. Stone felt a flash of anger. The kid had barely been flying professionally for 5 years, and now he was going to help bury a 32-year career. But as David testified, describing the tension in the cockpit, the way Stone had snapped at him during routine procedures, the atmosphere of fear rather than professional collaboration, Stone found his anger fading into something else: shame. Because David was just telling the truth. This was what it had been like to fly with him. This was the environment he'd created. First Officer Park, Attorney Wu asked, did you ever feel that Captain Stone's behavior compromised safety? David hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. Not directly. His technical flying skills were always excellent. But yes, sir, I felt that the hostile cockpit environment could have led to safety issues. In aviation, we rely on crew resource management, the ability of all crew members to speak up about concerns. In Captain Stone's cockpit, junior officers didn't feel safe questioning his decisions. And that's dangerous because sometimes the captain is wrong, and the only thing that prevents an accident is someone else noticing and speaking up. Next came Robert Michaels, the lead flight attendant. Robert had been flying for 14 years, and his testimony was damning in its simple honesty. He described multiple incidents over the years where Stone had berated crew members in front of passengers, where he'd dismissed safety concerns, where he'd used his authority to intimidate rather than lead. Mr. Michaels, Dr. Chen asked, how did Captain Stone's behavior affect crew morale and performance? It created a culture of fear, Robert said simply. When you're afraid of your captain, when you know that speaking up might result in being yelled at or written up for insubordination, you stop speaking up, you stop questioning. You just try to get through the flight without being the target of his anger. And that's not how safe operations work. Safety requires trust, communication, and the confidence that your concerns will be heard and addressed. We didn't have any of that with Captain Stone. The testimony continued through the morning. More crew members, passengers who'd been on that Denver flight and volunteered to speak. Each one added another layer to the picture of a man who'd confused authority with tyranny, respect with fear, leadership with dominance. During the lunch recess, Stone sat alone in the waiting area. Barnes had gone to make phone calls. Through the window, Stone could see the Kansas City skyline, could see aircraft passing overhead on their approach to the airport. He'd spent his entire adult life in aviation. It was all he knew, all he'd ever wanted to know, and now it was slipping away. And the worst part was that he understood why. When the hearing resumed, it was his turn. Barnes had prepared him for this, had coached him on what to say, how to present himself. But as Stone took the stand, he found himself abandoning the carefully crafted statement his lawyer had written. "I'm not going to sit here and make excuses," he began, his voice steady for the first time that day.
Everything that's been said in this room today is true. I did create a hostile environment. I did abuse my authority. I did treat passengers and crew as obstacles rather than people I was serving. And I did it not once, not twice, but consistently over years. He looked at the board members. For most of my career, I told myself I was just maintaining high standards, that I was being a strong leader, that people needed to respect the captain's authority. But listening to the testimony today, hearing how people actually experienced flying with me, I realized I was lying to myself. I wasn't a leader. I was a bully. And the only reason I got away with it for so long was because the system protected me. Morrison's expression was unreadable. Captain Stone, if your license were reinstated, with conditions, mandatory counseling, supervision, retraining, do you believe you could modify your behavior? Stone was quiet for a long moment. This was the opening his lawyer had been hoping for, the chance to demonstrate contrition and a commitment to change. But Stone found himself giving a different answer than the one he'd rehearsed. Honestly, sir, I don't know. I spent 32 years building habits, building a way of seeing myself and my role. Could I change that with some counseling and training? Maybe, but I also think there's something deeper that I need to confront, something about who I became over those years, and I don't know if I can fix that while still being a captain. The temptation to fall back into old patterns, to use the authority of the left seat to avoid the hard work of actually changing, I think that temptation would always be there. Barnes looked like he wanted to crawl under the table. This was not the testimony they'd planned. But Stone continued, "What I do know is that I owe an apology to every person who flew with me, every crew member who was afraid to speak up, every passenger who felt dismissed or diminished. I'm sorry, and I'm sorry that it took losing everything for me to finally understand what I'd become." Dr. Chen spoke up. "Captain Stone, that level of self-awareness is unusual in these hearings. Most pilots in your position spend their time making excuses or minimizing their behavior. Why do you think you're able to see it more clearly now?" "Because I have nothing left to lose," Stone said simply. "Before, I was Captain Stone. That was my entire identity. I'd built my self-worth around those 4 gold stripes. And when I felt that identity threatened, when Director Chen refused to move from that seat, I couldn't handle it. My entire sense of self was wrapped up in being obeyed, being in control. Now that it's all gone, now that I'm just Richard Stone without the title, I can finally see what I'd become, and it's not something I'm proud of." The hearing continued for another hour, with final statements from both sides. Margaret Chen presented her recommendation for permanent license revocation. Barnes made a last attempt to argue for reinstatement. But everyone in the room knew how this would end. Morrison announced that the board would deliberate and issue their decision within 10 days. The hearing was adjourned.
As Stone left the building, he found Margaret Chen standing in the parking lot, apparently waiting for him. For a moment, they just looked at each other, the investigator and the investigated, the enforcer and the broken pilot. "Director Chen," Stone said quietly, "I never thanked you." She looked surprised. "Thanked me?" "For not letting me get away with it, for doing your job even though it was probably easier to just file a report and move on, for caring enough about the people who fly on these planes to actually hold people like me accountable. So thank you." Margaret studied him for a moment. "Captain Stone, I've been doing this job for 20 years. I've ended a lot of careers. And most of the time, the pilot whose license I'm recommending for revocation spends their energy hating me, blaming me, trying to find ways to fight back. You're the first one who's ever thanked me." "I spent 6 weeks being angry at you," Stone admitted, "telling myself this was all your fault, that you'd set me up, that you were on some kind of power trip. But that was just me avoiding the truth. You didn't end my career, I did. You just made sure there were consequences for what I'd been doing for years." "What will you do now?" Margaret asked. Stone laughed, a hollow sound. "I have no idea. Flying was all I knew, all I was. I have to figure out who Richard Stone is when he's not Captain Stone. That's terrifying, honestly. But maybe it's also necessary.
For what it's worth, Margaret said, your testimony today, that self-awareness, that honesty, that took courage. More courage than most pilots in your position can manage. I hope you figure out who you are beyond the uniform, and I hope that person is better than the captain I observed for 6 months. She walked to her car, leaving Stone standing alone in the parking lot. Above him, a commercial jet passed overhead, its landing lights bright in the late afternoon sun. Stone watched it descend toward the runway, a familiar sight that now felt like a door closing forever. 10 days later, the decision letter arrived. It was brief and formal. License permanently revoked. No possibility of reinstatement. The board found that Captain Stone's pattern of behavior demonstrated a fundamental unsuitability for command responsibilities, and that the risk to passenger safety and crew well-being was too significant to allow any possibility to commercial aviation. Stone read the letter once, then folded it carefully and placed it in a drawer. He felt no anger, just a kind of sad acceptance. This was how it ended, not with a dramatic crash or heroic moment, but with a bureaucratic letter and a closed door. His wife, Patricia, had moved out the week before. She'd cited 30 years of arrogance, of being second to his career, of living with a man who saved all his patience for passengers and had none left for family. The divorce papers would be filed within the month. His children called occasionally, dutiful but distant. His savings would last perhaps a year if he was careful. At 56 years old, Richard Stone had to start over, and he had no idea how. The months that followed were difficult in ways Stone had never imagined. He applied for jobs, airport operations, flight instruction for private pilots, even maintenance coordination. But his history preceded him. The incident had been covered in aviation news. A quick Google search brought up articles, forum discussions, the full ugly story. No one in aviation wanted to hire him. He tried non-aviation jobs, retail management, customer service. Even those doors closed when background checks revealed his history. "You were fired from your last job for mistreating customers?" an interviewer asked. "That's not really the skill set we're looking for." 8 months after the hearing, Stone was working the night shift at a shipping warehouse, loading trucks and moving boxes. It was hard, physical labor, minimum wage, no benefits. He came home at dawn to a small one-bedroom apartment, his body aching, his mind exhausted. This was not the retirement he'd imagined. This was not how a 32-year career was supposed to end. But slowly, painfully, something began to shift. The physical work left him too tired for the spiraling thoughts, the endless what-ifs and if-onlys. The simplicity of the job, move this box here, load that pallet there, was almost meditative. And the people he worked with, blue-collar workers who knew nothing about aviation and cared less about his history, treated him as just another guy on the warehouse floor. One of his co-workers, a man named Marcus, noticed Stone struggling one night. "You okay, man? You look like you're about to collapse." "Just tired," Stone said. "How old are you? 55, 60? You shouldn't be doing this kind of work at your age. What happened? You lose everything in a divorce?" "Something like that," Stone said. Marcus nodded sympathetically. "Been there. Had a whole career, thought I was set for life, then everything fell apart. Ended up here. But you know what? It's not so bad. Honest work. Nobody expects you to be anything except reliable. No office politics, no kissing up to management. Just do your job, cash your check, go home. There's something clean about that." Stone thought about that conversation a lot in the weeks that followed. Clean. That was a good word for it. This job didn't require him to be Captain Stone. It didn't require him to project authority or command respect. It just required him to show up and work. And there was a strange kind of freedom in that. 1 year after losing his license, Stone received an unexpected email. It was from a nonprofit organization called Aviation Safety Advocates. They worked on reforming airline safety culture, cockpit resource management, and crew reporting systems. They'd heard about his case and wanted to know if he'd be willing to speak at their annual conference. "We're not looking for a villain to parade around," the email read. We're looking for someone who can speak honestly about how a safety culture breaks down, how power corrupts even well-intentioned professionals, and how the system needs to change to prevent cases like yours. If you're willing to be vulnerable and honest, we think your story could help a lot of people."
Stone stared at the email for days before responding. The idea of standing up in front of aviation professionals and essentially confessing to being everything wrong with airline culture was terrifying. But it was also, somehow, right. He accepted. The conference was in Seattle 6 months later. Stone stood backstage in a borrowed suit. He'd sold most of his nice clothes when money got tight, waiting for his turn to speak. His hands were shaking. He'd faced emergency landings, engine failures, and terrifying weather with less fear than he felt now. When his name was called, he walked onto the stage and looked out at the audience. 300 people, pilots, flight attendants, safety professionals, FAA officials. And there, in the third row, he saw Margaret Chen. She nodded at him once, a small gesture of acknowledgement. Stone began to speak. "My name is Richard Stone. 2 years ago, I was a captain with Skybridge Airlines. I had 32 years of experience, 300,000 flight hours, and a spotless safety record. Today, I work the night shift at a warehouse, and I'm here to tell you that I deserve to lose everything." For the next 45 minutes, Stone told his story. Not a sanitized version, not a story designed to make himself look sympathetic. He told the truth about the arrogance, the bullying, the systematic abuse of authority. He told them about the crew members he'd intimidated, the passengers he'd dismissed, the years of getting away with behavior that should never have been tolerated. "The system protected me," he said, "not because I was a good captain, but because I was a convenient captain. I was always on time, I never caused delays, I made the numbers look good. And as long as the numbers looked good, nobody wanted to dig too deep into how I treated people. That's a failure of leadership, of management, of culture. But it's also a failure on my part, because I knew what I was doing was wrong, and I did it anyway, because I could." He talked about the moment Margaret Chen had shown her badge, the feeling of his entire world collapsing. "I wanted to be angry at her. I wanted to blame her for ruining my life. But the truth is, she saved lives. Because if I'd kept flying, eventually my contempt for procedure, my dismissal of crew concerns, my belief that I was above the rules, eventually that would have led to a mistake that got people killed. She stopped that from happening." The audience was silent. Stone could see some people nodding, others looking uncomfortable, a few with tears in their eyes. "I can't get my career back," he concluded, "and I don't deserve to. But I can stand here and tell you that the next time you see a captain who seems untouchable, who everyone's afraid to question, who treats authority as a personal privilege rather than a professional responsibility, don't look away. Don't tell yourself it's not your problem. Don't wait for someone else to speak up. Because that captain is a disaster waiting to happen, and every day he keeps flying is another day that luck is the only thing keeping people safe." When he finished, there was a long moment of silence. Then, slowly, people began to applaud. It wasn't the enthusiastic applause of approval. It was something more somber, more thoughtful. The applause of people who recognized difficult truth. After the speech, dozens of people approached Stone. Some were critical, telling him he'd gotten off too easy. But most were unexpectedly supportive. Flight attendants who'd had their own experiences with toxic captains. First officers who'd been afraid to speak up. Safety officers who'd seen patterns like his and struggled to get management to care. And Margaret Chen approached him last. "That was a brave speech," she said. "I don't know about brave," Stone replied. "Maybe just necessary. You were right that day in the parking lot. I needed to figure out who Richard Stone was without the uniform. It took me a long time, but I think I'm finally starting to figure it out. What have you learned?" Stone thought about that. That authority without accountability is just tyranny.
that respect has to be earned, not demanded, that the people you have power over aren't obstacles. They're human beings who deserve dignity. Basic stuff, really. Stuff I should have learned 30 years ago. But better late than never, I guess. Margaret smiled slightly. You know, when I suspended your license, I thought that would be the end of your story. A cautionary tale, a data point in my report. But maybe it's not the end. Maybe it's just a very different middle than you expected. Maybe, Stone agreed. I'm never going to fly commercially again. That door is closed. But maybe I can use what happened to me to help change the culture that enabled me. Maybe that's worth something. It is, Margaret said. It absolutely is. 5 years after losing his license, Richard Stone had built an unexpected second career. He consulted for aviation safety organizations, speaking at conferences, training sessions, and airline management meetings. He'd co-authored a book about safety culture and the psychology of authority. He testified before Congress about the need for stronger protections for crew members who report concerns about captains. He still worked part-time at the warehouse. He'd been promoted to shift supervisor, and he managed his team with a philosophy of respect and collaboration that he wished he'd learned decades earlier. The pay was still modest, but it was enough to live on, especially combined with his speaking fees. His relationship with his children had slowly improved. His daughter Sarah had reached out first, telling him that she was proud of the work he was doing now, that she saw him trying to make amends. His son, Thomas, was still distant, still hurt by years of having a father who was never emotionally present. But they talked occasionally, and Stone held on to hope that time might heal that wound. He never remarried. Patricia had moved on, and Stone had come to understand that he needed to be comfortable being alone, being just himself, before he could be good for anyone else. On the 5th anniversary of that fateful flight to Denver, Stone received an email from Robert Michaels, the flight attendant who testified at his hearing. Robert was now a trainer for Skybridge's new crew resource management program, a program that had been implemented as part of the reforms Margaret Chen had mandated.
I wanted you to know, Robert wrote, that the culture at Skybridge has changed dramatically. Junior crew members aren't afraid to speak up anymore. Captains who show toxic behavior are immediately flagged and required to go through intervention. We have an independent reporting system that actually gets taken seriously. And a lot of that change happened because your case exposed just how broken the old system was. So, in a weird way, thank you. What you did was terrible, but what came after has made flying safer for thousands of people. Stone read that email 3 times, tears streaming down his face. He'd spent 5 years trying to make amends, trying to turn his catastrophic failure into something meaningful. And here, finally, was evidence that it had mattered. He wrote back, "Thank you for telling me that. You have no idea how much I needed to hear it. And thank you for being brave enough to tell the truth at my hearing, even though it was difficult. You helped save the career I didn't deserve to keep, and in doing so, you helped save me from myself. I hope the new culture at Skybridge honors the courage of people like you." That evening, Stone stood on the small balcony of his apartment, watching planes pass overhead on their approach to the nearby airport. Once, that sight would have filled him with pride, with a sense of belonging to an elite club. Now it filled him with something different, gratitude that those passengers were in the hands of pilots better than he had been, pilots flying in a culture that valued safety over ego. His phone rang. It was an unknown number. He answered, "Mr. Stone, this is Jennifer Martinez. You probably don't remember me, but I was the gate agent that day, 5 years ago, at O'Hare when everything happened." Stone felt his chest tighten. "I remember. I'm so sorry you had to witness that, Miss Martinez. Please, call me Jennifer. I'm calling because I'm finishing my degree in aviation management, and I'm writing my thesis on safety culture reform in commercial aviation. Your case is a central part of it. I was wondering if you'd be willing to be interviewed." "Of course," Stone said. "But can I ask you something first? Why this topic? Why focus on the worst moment of my career?"
Jennifer was quiet for a moment. Because it wasn't just your moment. I'd worked at that airline for 3 years when you had that confrontation with Director Chen. And I'd seen so many captains treat people badly, crew members, passengers, gate agents like me. I'd seen them throw their weight around, act like they were untouchable, and nothing ever happened to them. So when you finally faced consequences, when the system actually worked for once, it gave me hope. It made me believe that aviation could be better, that we didn't have to just accept toxic behavior as that's how captains are. Your fall, as terrible as it was for you, showed me that change was possible. So I want to write about that, about how one person being held accountable can transform an entire system. Stone closed his eyes, overwhelmed. Jennifer, I'll tell you anything you want to know. And thank you. Thank you for seeing something hopeful in the worst thing I ever did. After the call ended, Stone sat on his balcony for a long time, watching the planes, thinking about trajectories and second chances, and the strange winding path that had brought him from a cockpit to a warehouse to this moment of unexpected redemption. He'd lost everything: his career, his license, his marriage, his identity. But in losing everything, he'd found something he'd never had when he wore those 4 gold stripes: humility, self-awareness, and the understanding that who you are matters more than what you command. It wasn't the ending Richard Stone had imagined for his story, but perhaps, in its own painful way, it was a better one. An ending that wasn't really an ending at all, but rather a transformation. From captain to cautionary tale to finally someone who might help prevent the next Richard Stone from making the same mistakes. The sun set over the city. Another plane passed overhead, its lights blinking in the gathering darkness. Stone watched it until it disappeared from sight, then went inside. Tomorrow, he had a speech to give at a flight training academy. Tomorrow, he would stand in front of young pilots just starting their careers and tell them the story of how arrogance destroys everything it touches. Tomorrow, he would keep trying to make amends. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough.